It's May the 25th, 1983. The final part of the Star Wars original trilogy, Return of the Jedi, has just been released in the United States and Canada, with audiences waiting overnight. The film would make a profit within 5 weeks, and coupled with the addition of commercial licenses, the potential backstories of the likes of Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, which had been teased by George Lucas, seemed a formality. But for all the apparent success, this was the lowest point of the life of Lucas, and his previous 6 years of work that he had put into Star Wars was placed on the shelf, where it remained for over a decade. This is the story of everything that happened between the end of Return of the Jedi and the start of The Phantom Menace. This is the 16-year itch that never went away. The 1952 play and late adaptation of The 7-Year Itch is a story of a relationship that deteriorated over time, and this was the effect that the making of the original Star Wars trilogy had on George and Marcia Lucas. Throughout the trilogy, Marcia was heavily influential in writing and editing, and in particular, the emotion of the characters portrayed on screen. But starting in Empire Strikes Back, George's devotion to Star Wars was making him cold. As she would describe at the end of their marriage, George had become an emotional wall and a workaholic, and this showed throughout Return of the Jedi, with constant arguments that even extended to other crew members, such as Dwayne Dunham and Howard Kazanjan. The frustrations of George would be seen in the film itself, such as Boba Fett being dumped into the Sarlacc pit, in reflection of his frustration, and despite promises of raising their child, his decision to make another Indiana Jones film was the final straw for Marcia. So when Return of the Jedi was released, what should have been a celebration of success had just become the worst time of his life, and with the exception of Indiana Jones, George Lucas was done with making films. As Lucas entered what he described as a multi-year tailspin, the franchise he had left abandoned was able to survive with the sale of action figures and the production of spin-offs. Shortly after the release of Return of the Jedi were 2 films based on the Ewoks, with the first called A Caravan of Courage released in 1984, and The Battle of Endor which followed 2 years later, and they aimed to redeem themselves after the holiday special by drawing a younger audience. This was followed by an animation series known as Droids, based around the adventures of R2-D2 and C-3PO, and it created an arcade-style game and other merchandise, but it was clear that the franchise was becoming a memory of the past. Lucas had turned into a background figure within Star Wars, as he was quietly observing the making of Indiana Jones, but he helped design an attraction at Disneyland California called Star Tours, which was a military-grade simulator with visual sequences of TIE fighters and a space battle around the Death Star, all the while being asked about a potential Star Wars prequel trilogy. Whilst he had no intentions of making one in 1987, the vision he had then was similar to what actually happened, with Obi-Wan training Anakin, Palpatine being a two-faced politician who turns Anakin to the dark side, a duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin on a volcano, and finally Luke and Leia being split up to protect them from the Jedi hunting Sith. Despite these ideas, the reality for Lucas was that he was still struggling, especially from his divorce settlement several years earlier, so he couldn't fund a new Star Wars film that met his lofty expectations, and the franchise itself had turned into a political statement that tarnished its reputation. Even before the release of Return of the Jedi, the United States President at the time, Ronald Reagan, had proposed a defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative, aimed at intercepting an array of missiles. With battle stations on both Earth and in space, opposing senators and the media were called the Initiative Star Wars, and Lucas hated the connection, so he tried and failed to win a court case, adding to his pile of misery and financial troubles. Lucas thankfully had his visual effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, in reserve, and during his hiatus, the company worked on movies such as Back to the Future to help cover the costs for some of his losses. This was also the time when the annual Star Wars convention was founded, and Lucas would be asked about the prequels again, and this time he deflected the questions, rather than denying them, with answers ranging from a lack of energy to other interests such as his private life. But the introduction of the convention and the Star Wars role-playing game by West End Games, with sourcebooks and supplements, couldn't hide the fact that Star Wars was still in decline, with audiences looking for alternatives, such as the controversial ill-fated Masters of the Universe. After the release of the last printings of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Han Solo Adventures, and a set of Lando Calrissian books, the official Star Wars fan club was deactivated by Lucas himself, and the original trilogy had turned into a classic set of films. Splinter of the Mind's Eye, incidentally, was actually written alongside A New Hope, with the aim of creating a low-budget sequel film, but as the Star Wars franchise grew, he abandoned the low-budget idea. As the first novel in the expanded universe, the author Alan Dean Foster was somewhat limited, as he couldn't use the likes of Han Solo or Chewbacca, nor could he mention Darth Vader being Luke's father, so that Lucas ensured he had options for Empire Strikes Back. Likewise with the first of the Han Solo books, known as At Star's End, events were restricted to before the original trilogy, with Harrison Ford's continuation in the films still a matter of dispute, but when Lucas started to retreat into the background of Star Wars, so did these books. At the end of the 1980s, Lucas still considered Star Wars as a project for the future, whilst he worked on Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, then the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and it was during these productions that he inadvertently set the foundations for the Star Wars prequel trilogy. The declining health of his parents and the raising of his children had been the biggest priorities since the end of Return of the Jedi, and he would also start the George Lucas Educational Foundation, which aimed to innovate learning through the use of technology, and with the Indiana Jones Chronicles, it inspired an innovative type of filmmaking. At the reignited Skywalker Ranch, Lucas introduced software called EditDroid, which was a non-linear computer editor that streamlined the finding of discarded clips and tripled the speed of an average film edit, and he stored any footage in video discs. This was combined with a digital audio tool called SoundDroid and visual effects made from digitalized backgrounds and composites, something he would develop for the prequel trilogy. Both EditDroid and SoundDroid were not without their faults, with continuous bugs and glitches since his birth in 1980, but after these projects were sold, Lucas would continue to tinker with this revolutionary technology, and it reignited some of his passion for filmmaking. He began to wonder if he could apply some of his new techniques to resurrect the Star Wars franchise, as using digital sets would be much cheaper and allow creations on a greater scale. But for now, these innovations could not save Young Indiana Jones Chronicles from only lasting 2 seasons, as Lucas and the ABC network failed to see eye to eye, and even Harrison Ford appearing in the second season couldn't prevent the low ratings. Nevertheless, not only did the show win multiple Emmy Awards for visual effects and sound composition, but for the first time in almost a decade, Lucas was enjoying his filmmaking and described it as his happiest and most engaging project. At the same time, the Star Wars franchise was showing signs of revival thanks to the Dark Horse comic series Dark Empire, game releases on the Nintendo Game Boy with trading cards and figures, but most significantly, the Heir to the Empire novels. The birth of this trilogy could be considered an accident, and beginning in 1988, the author Lou Aronica, who worked for Bantam Books, would ask Lucas for permission to publish stories based on events after Return of the Jedi. At that time, Lucas had resigned from Star Wars, so he thought any novels would fail to sell, and he allowed Timothy Zahn to begin writing. The only constraints were that the novels were set after Return of the Jedi to leave room for the prequel trilogy, and he couldn't use any characters who had been killed off in the films, so this prevented Jorah Sabath becoming a clone of Obi-Wan. When the book was released on June 4th, 1991, the expectations of failure from Lucas were destroyed when the book sold 60,000 copies in its first week, and Star Wars had risen from the ashes.